and author of a self-critical look at how the news is made. So, why is public trust in the news media dropping?
They tend to believe that journalists are rude, or they don't care about the people that they're covering, or they are too negative, and so they often have negative views of reporters while still believing what they see or read.
The thing people most doubt about the news media is whether they treat the subjects fairly. There are times dealing with the victims of crime, dealing with the victims of terrorism, when you can clearly point to examples where the media have run roughshod over people's sensibility.
What bothers me the most, I think, is our tendency to oversimplify, to characterize a complex human being in terms of some two-word catchphrase.
And what should be done to regain the public trust? Broder and the others say accountability.
We cannot report everything that's going on, and the act of selection is the most crucial decision that any journalist makes. What do you leave out, not what do you put in? And people are right to question us about our news judgments.
I think that they have, at bottom, a noble sense of their own profession, and they want to be fair, and they want to feel like they're doing a good job. They think of the public as having somehow a sacred trust or covenant with them, and this gives the public a special privilege which I don't think it's fully aware of.
But often the public tends to squander that privilege.
When somebody writes me a letter, the opening line is, "You sniveling New York Jew," I tend to discount that criticism.
Perhaps the key to a more accountable news media is a press that is self-skeptical, a move Greenfield and Broder see beginning to happen, but not enough.
Each news organization is kind of a law unto itself. There is a tendency for a kind of groupthink to develop within a news organization, for assumptions not to be challenged, for conventional ways of looking at things not to be re-examined.
The biggest problem we have now, I think, in the mass media is we do not have an institutional, regular way of letting critics use the media to talk back. The media would do a lot more to encourage trust if they were to acknowledge what they did wrong, and in that same format, sometimes, if they felt they were right, explain why.
It's not easy or pleasant to admit mistakes, not for reporters, news organizations, or even powerful television ministries. But responsiveness to public criticism may only happen faster when it can be seen that admitting mistakes is not a sign of weakness, but of strength and growth. John DeDakis, CBN News, Washington.
To discuss this issue further, we have standing by in our Washington studios CBN News White House correspondent John DeDakis with some very special guests. John, welcome.
Thank you very much, Ben. Joining me this morning on the 700 Club is Lesley Stahl, the national correspondent for CBS News and former White House correspondent, and Cal Thomas, who is a syndicated columnist with the Los Angeles Times. Before that, he was a spokesman for Jerry Falwell, and before that, he was a reporter for NBC in Houston, Texas.
And before that, I was a child.
Okay, let's start out. Why is the public losing trust in the news media, and what do you believe is the chief justifiable criticism, Lesley?
Well, John, the poll you cited in your report was a January poll, and even as I remember, the pollster said it's directly related to the Iran scandal. People did not want to believe that this government, this administration, particularly this very popular president, had done something like selling weapons to the Ayatollah. What happens with the media over and over and over when there are scandals like this is that they tend to blame the messenger. I don't want to hear this. I don't believe it. It's impossible. It doesn't make sense. So I think in January, when the facts really weren't as spelled out as they are today, there was a sense that the press is wrong. A lot of the sources we had were unidentified, anonymous sources. And
but the president's believability went down
even
as well.
more. Yeah, his belief. But you asked me specifically about the press. I think you'll see that our credibility over history goes up and down. And we will suffer with a popular president whom we are telling the public negative things about, period.
On this messenger argument, though, isn't it true that it's not just the messenger, because reporters are also able to write the message?
Well, I think we do less of that than we're accused of doing. I think we report the views of a lot of people. But I think that the writing of the message is something the public perceives, but is not often In fact, very rarely does that happen.
So what I'm hearing you say is that there isn't really any justifiable criticism of the press?
No, I'm not saying that at all. You asked me why the public is losing trust and faith. I think it was the January situation. I think it was Iran and messages from the through the press to the public that maybe this administration had done something that they didn't want to hear about.
So what criticisms of the news media are justified, do you think? What's the major
I think
criticism?
there are excesses. And I enjoyed hearing your piece, and I kept saying to myself, that's right, that's right. We do tend to be uncaring and insensitive when a scandal is out there. There's a competitive spirit that just drives us, some of us, over the edge.
Tell me about Watergate. You covered Watergate.
I covered Watergate.
And you were on the stakeouts.
Every morning.
Excessive?
On a stakeout. Very excessive. I'll make a confession. I, one morning, was staking out Jeb Magruder's house, and his kid came out to walk to school, and I shouted a question to his child, who must have been 5 or 6. Mrs. Magruder came running out of the house and basically told me off at the top of her lungs. And it was like a cold shower. She was right. I shouldn't have been involving a child. How horrible. It was like that.
Cal, what is the most justifiable criticism of the news media?
Well, I would agree with Lesley to some of these things, but you know, in a free society, and I'm going to take the defense position here as a journalist for most of my life, the whole idea of accountability is very important. And though we in the press do sometimes make mistakes, what we're dealing with here is a government, the United States government, the most powerful government on earth. And we have seen what power and arrogance and money and a feeling of over self-worth can do to a person. Pride goes before the fall, the scriptures say. And so even though we in the press are unelected watchdogs, I think to have watchdogs, to have people who hold powerful people accountable, whether it be on Wall Street, whether it be in government, or now we've seen the value of having people to hold religious leaders accountable, may have prevented some of the scandal we're now seeing across the newspapers and the airwaves. Very important. Now, how do we deal with us in the press? I don't know of anybody, or very few people, certainly responsible ones, who think that government is a solution. Government has problems delivering the mail at a reasonable price. They certainly shouldn't be regulating those who report on them. But I think programs like this, forums like the American Society for Newspaper Editors and the Publishers Associations and the Radio and Television News Directors Associations ought to have worked into their programs opportunities where we can come and discuss our failings, discuss our weaknesses, like Lesley has done with great candor here this morning, as kind of a self-corrective thing. I think love is having to say you're sorry. And I think with freedom goes responsibility. We have an awful lot of freedom. I think we need to demonstrate some responsibility. One
criticism of the news media is that reporters tend to have a sort of a relativistic approach or a worldview where moral values or values that impinge on various issues aren't understood because there's a relativistic framework. Most reporters surveyed by Lichter Rothman said adultery they thought was okay, for instance. So how do you report womanizing of a presidential candidate?
Maybe philosophically they think that way, but you better not find their spouse messing around or they'll take a totally different view. I think this is one of the problems, and I came up through the business in the early 60s when it was virtually all white and virtually all male. And one of the things that gave increasing credibility to the media for blacks was the employment of more blacks and the sensitivity to more stories that were of importance to blacks. The same with women. Long overdue, much discriminated against in this business. But now when people who hold to a moral value system, Christian, Jewish, or whatever, look for a reflection in the media of some of their views and values, or people who reflect those values at the networks and with the newspapers, they don't see them as often. I know that in my newspapers,
Lesley's shaking her head. Why?
Well, because I don't believe reporters should ever be biased, and I think adopting one religion's moral view would be the same as becoming a Democrat or a Republican. But I do think we should put those views on the air, and I think we do.
But doesn't it go to what Broder was talking about, that there's this groupthink, and that what's a story is automatically assumed to be a story?
The public assumes that that CBS is a monolith in terms of values or whatever, and it isn't. Believe me, it isn't.
There are conservatives there?
There are a lot of conservatives there. In fact, I think that that the place has been run by conservatives for a couple of years, and I think that the public hasn't shifted its impression of CBS from a decade ago. But I think if you watch with an open mind, you'll see that we have there's been a shift.
Is there a problem in television focusing so much on personalities and being impeded by the technology that issues almost take second back seat, yet most people watch television for their news?
I think we are enormously constrained by the time that we have. The evening news has about 23 minutes of actual time for a news story. The White House correspondent gets an average of 90 seconds.
So what can be done?
Give us more time.
Right.
We've been operating under that problem forever. It used to be a 15-minute news show. David Broder, in your piece, was suggesting we do more and more and more. We don't have the space. I'm not saying we don't need to change and improve. We do, but we are operating under a problem that doesn't seem to be expanding for us.
Let me return just for a moment to something Lesley said about a monolithic religious view, because everybody has a religious view and everybody is biased. Brinkley once said, when the two of us worked at NBC together, he said, "It's impossible to be objective, so we must try to be fair." I think that's probably the best thing I've ever heard. We all have our beliefs, whether it's in God or no God or whatever, but what is necessary is to be fair. Let's take the misuse of the word fundamentalist, for example. It's used as a modifier for every kind of erratic and indefensible behavior, from blowing up cars in Beirut to sending off 12-year-olds to fight in the Iran-Iraq war, to seeing TV preachers, to people who carry around 40-pound King James Bibles while wearing polyester suits and white socks. But unfortunately, it's become a negative stereotype. I remember when all of this business hit the fan on the Baker Oral Roberts stuff, the New York Times ran a glossary of terms. It was the first time that I can ever recall in a major newspaper the definitions being given to Pentecostal, fundamentalist, even born again. I had a reporter for the Christian Science Monitor ask me at the Democratic Convention in 1984, after doing an interview with me, she said, "Are you born again?" I said, "What do you mean by that?" She said, "Well, you know." I said, "Yeah, I know, but do you know?" She didn't know, but she was going to use the word in her story anyway. That's unfortunate.
I'm going to have to wrap up, but I want to ask you both a quick question. How can TV be more responsive to its critics? In other words, if people have a gripe with you, how can they register that in a way that's going to be taken seriously?
That is a wonderful question. You know, if we make an error of fact, we will correct it on the CBS Evening News. But if there's these questions of judgment, questions of fairness, the truth is that's very difficult to deal with. We tend not to correct those. We don't even.
Is that a mistake?
It may be a mistake, but I really don't know the vehicle. I think though, if you are criticized, it has a slightly chilling effect for the next time. I know that's true with me. If I get a negative letter,
well,
it's a little
I want to
chilling.
pick up on what Lesley said and what Jeff Greenfield said. A letter is very important. We are professionals. We care about our business. We care about the kind of thing we're doing. We're not just in it to make money and buy big cars and live in the fast lane. A nicely gentlemanly or ladylike letter that doesn't start off, as Jeff said, you know, you New York Jew or whatever,
ink,
and three different color ink and all of this is very helpful and very useful.
Okay,
it does work. They are read.
We're out of time. Thank you very much to Lesley Stahl of CBS
Thanks,
News
John.
and Cal Thomas of the Los Angeles Times. I'm John DeDakis, CBN News in Washington. Ben, back to you.
Before you dismiss our illustrious guest there